This first story takes place in a small neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon, during a storm that knocked out power for most of the area. I was 26 at the time, living alone in a rented house at the end of a quiet residential street. It was one of those neighborhoods where most people knew each other, but not particularly well. There were no sidewalks on my side of the street, and beyond the houses behind mine was a wooded area that eventually connected to a larger park. The storm started around 9 that night. By 11, the rain was coming down so hard that I could barely see the houses across the street through my living room window. I remember turning off the television because the power kept flickering. I figured I would just go to bed early. Then I saw someone standing across the street. At first I assumed it was one of my neighbors. The person was wearing a dark rain jacket and standing underneath a tree, facing directly toward my house. I watched for maybe 10 seconds. Then lightning flashed. For a moment I could see him clearly. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at me. I stepped away from the window. A few seconds later, I looked again. He was gone. I checked the front door and made sure it was locked. Then I checked the back door. Everything seemed normal. I went upstairs. About 15 minutes later, I heard something downstairs. It wasn't a loud noise. It sounded like the handle of the front door being moved. I froze. Then it happened again. Someone was slowly pushing down on the handle. I grabbed my phone and called 911. While I was whispering to the dispatcher, I heard the front door creak. I knew it was locked, but whoever was outside was putting enough pressure on it to make the frame move. The dispatcher told me to stay upstairs and not confront anyone. I went into my bedroom, locked the door, and turned off the lights. Then I heard footsteps. They were inside the house. For several seconds, I couldn't move. The footsteps stopped beneath my bedroom. Then there was silence. I could hear rain hitting the roof. Then someone slowly walked up the stairs. One step, then another. I backed away from the bedroom door and waited. The footsteps reached the top. I heard someone walking down the hallway. Then the bedroom door handle moved. The person tried it once, then twice. I could hear the police sirens approaching outside. The handle suddenly stopped moving. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps running back downstairs. Then the front door slammed. The police arrived less than a minute later. They searched the house and found the back window above the kitchen sink partially open. There were wet footprints on the floor. The police also found that the screen had been cut. They searched the neighborhood but didn't find anyone. The strangest part came afterward. An officer asked me whether I recognized the man I had seen across the street. I told him I didn't. He looked at me for a moment and said, "We found a backpack in the woods behind your house. Inside were gloves, a flashlight, a change of clothes, and a printed photograph. The photograph was of my house. It had been taken from the woods. The date printed on the back was 3 days earlier. I moved out 2 months later. I still think about that night whenever I see someone standing alone outside in heavy rain. Because I used to think the frightening part was seeing a stranger watching my house. Now I think the frightening part was realizing he had already been watching it for days." The second story happened to me while I was driving through rural Pennsylvania during a thunderstorm. I was 19 and heading home from college for the weekend. It was after midnight when I realized I was almost out of gas. The rain was so heavy that I could barely see the road. I spotted a gas station about a mile ahead and pulled in. There were no other customers. The convenience store was still open, though. I went inside, paid for my gas, and grabbed a bottle of water. The cashier was an older man who barely looked up at me. As I walked back toward my car, I noticed another vehicle parked at the far end of the lot. It was an old silver SUV. There was someone sitting inside. I didn't think much of it. I started pumping gas. The SUV pulled forward. Then it stopped. I looked over. The driver was staring at me. I ignored him. A few seconds later, the SUV pulled away. I finished pumping and got into my car. Then I noticed something strange. The same SUV was parked across the road. I could see its headlights through the rain. I started driving. A few miles later, I noticed the SUV behind me. I told myself it was probably coincidence. Then I turned onto another road. It followed. I made another turn. It followed again. At that point, I started getting nervous. I called my roommate and told him what was happening. He told me to keep driving and head toward a police station. I searched on my phone and found one about 15 minutes away. The SUV stayed behind me. Then it disappeared. I felt relieved, until I saw it again in my rearview mirror. This time it was much closer. I accelerated. So did the SUV. I eventually reached the police station, but the building looked completely dark. I pulled into the parking lot anyway. The SUV drove past. It didn't stop. I waited several minutes. Then I noticed the SUV turn around at the end of the street. I called 911. The dispatcher told me to remain inside my locked car. A patrol officer arrived shortly afterward. He drove around the area but couldn't find the SUV. The officer took down the license plate information I had managed to remember. 2 days later, a detective called me. They had found the vehicle. It belonged to a man who had been questioned in connection with several reports of women being followed on the same stretch of highway. They couldn't prove he had intended to harm me, but the detective told me something that still bothers me. The gas station had security cameras. The SUV had entered the parking lot approximately 10 minutes before I arrived. The driver had apparently watched me enter the store. Then he waited. He didn't just happen to be going in the same direction as me. He had been sitting there before I ever saw him. I never found out why he followed me, and honestly, I'm glad I didn't. I rented the cabin because I wanted to spend a weekend alone. It was in northern Michigan, several miles from the nearest town. The property had 4 small cabins scattered around a lake. Mine was the last one. There was almost no cell service. That wasn't a problem at first. I arrived Friday afternoon, unpacked, made dinner, and spent most of the evening reading. Around midnight, the storm started. The rain hit the roof so loudly that I couldn't hear much else. I was about to go to bed when I noticed headlights outside. A vehicle had stopped near the entrance to the property. I assumed another guest had arrived. Then the headlights turned off. The vehicle remained there. I waited. Nothing happened. Eventually, I went to bed. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up because someone knocked on my door. 3 times. I didn't answer. There was another knock. Then a man's voice said, "Hey, sorry, can you help me?" I stayed silent. He knocked again. "I'm having car trouble." I looked through the window beside the door. I couldn't see anyone. I called the property owner. He answered after several rings. I asked whether another guest was staying nearby. He said no. Then he told me something that immediately made my stomach drop. The cabin next to mine was empty. All of them were. I went back to the window. The man was standing beside my car. He was looking directly at the driver's door. I called 911. The dispatcher told me to stay inside. Then the man walked around the cabin. I could hear his shoes moving through the wet grass. He stopped beneath my bedroom window. Then I heard him say my name. I had never told him my name. I moved away from the window. The man walked back toward the front door. Then I heard the doorknob move. He tried the door once. Then he tried the window. I grabbed my keys and went into the bathroom. The only other exit was a small window. I opened it and climbed outside. The rain was freezing. I crouched behind the cabin and moved toward the trees. I could hear the man inside. He had gotten through the front door. I ran toward the main road. A sheriff's deputy found me several minutes later. They searched the property. The man was gone, but they found something inside my cabin. A screwdriver had been left on the kitchen floor. The property owner later told police that a previous guest had complained about a man asking questions about the cabins. They never identified him. I never went back. But there is one detail I still think about. When the police arrived, they found tire tracks leading away from the cabin. The vehicle that made those tracks had been parked near the property entrance earlier that night, but it hadn't been there when I arrived. Someone had apparently driven onto the property while I was already inside, and they had stayed there for hours before knocking on my door. was a freshman at a university in Ohio when this happened. My roommate had gone home for the weekend, so I had the dorm room to myself. It was raining heavily that night. Around 1 in the morning, I heard someone walking down the hallway. That wasn't unusual. People were constantly coming and going. Then someone knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole. There was nobody there. I waited. A few seconds later, another knock. Still nobody. I called my roommate. While we were talking, I heard footsteps move away from my door. Then they stopped. I looked through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. My roommate told me to call campus security. I felt embarrassed because I wasn't even sure anything had happened. Then I received a text message. It was from an unknown number. It said, "I can see your light." I immediately turned it off. Another message arrived. "Why did you turn it off?" I called campus security. The officer asked me to stay inside and lock the door. While I was waiting, another message arrived. "Open the door." I didn't respond. Then I heard someone walking toward my room. The footsteps stopped outside. Someone tried the handle. Once. Then again. The door moved slightly. I stood behind my desk and waited. The person outside didn't speak. Then I heard footsteps running away. Campus security arrived within minutes. They checked the hallway and surrounding floors but found nobody. They also checked the building's cameras. The following morning, security contacted me. They had footage of a man entering the dorm building through a side entrance. He wasn't a student. He had apparently followed another resident through the door. Security found him on another floor later that day. He was carrying a backpack containing several phones, charging cables, and personal items. I never found out exactly how long he had been inside the building, but security told me something that changed the way I thought about the incident. He had been standing outside my room for several minutes before knocking. He had apparently been watching my room from the opposite end of the hallway. The messages had come from a prepaid phone. The number was never connected to him. I moved to another dorm the following semester. Even now, whenever I'm alone in a hallway and hear footsteps stop outside a closed door, I instinctively check the lock. The last story happened in a rural town in West Virginia. My parents owned a small house at the end of a gravel road. I was 24 and staying there alone while they were out of state. There were only 3 other houses on the road. Beyond them was forest. One night in November, a severe storm came through. The wind was strong enough to knock branches against the roof. Around 11:30, I heard something hit the side of the house. I assumed it was a branch. Then I heard it again. This time it sounded like someone knocking. I checked the windows. Nothing. I went back to the living room. A few minutes later, my outdoor motion light turned on. I looked through the window. A man was standing beside my father's truck. I couldn't see his face because of the rain. I called 911. The man walked toward the house. Then he disappeared from view. I checked the front door. Locked. Back door. Locked. Then I heard glass breaking. It came from the garage. I moved into the bedroom and locked the door. The man entered through the garage. I could hear him moving around downstairs. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't rushing. He was simply walking through the house. That made it worse. I called the dispatcher again and whispered that someone was inside. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. I pushed a dresser against the bedroom door. The footsteps stopped outside. The man tried the handle. I held the dresser in place. He pushed harder. Then suddenly, everything stopped. A few seconds later, I heard someone shouting downstairs. The police had arrived. The intruder ran out through the garage, but was caught several hundred yards down the road. The police later determined that he had been staying in an abandoned property nearby. They also discovered that he had been watching the house. There were cigarette butts and food wrappers near a tree overlooking the driveway. My parents had apparently been away for almost a week. The man had known the house was empty. What we couldn't determine was why he chose that particular night to enter. The officer told me he probably assumed nobody was home. That explanation never made me feel better, because the house had been dark for several nights. Then I arrived, and Somehow, within a few hours, someone knew I don't stay alone there anymore. My parents eventually sold the property. The house itself wasn't isolated enough to be completely cut off from civilization. There were other houses nearby. There was a road. There were neighbors. There was cell service. And still that night, I remember realizing something that I had never really considered before. A place doesn't have to be completely remote to make you feel completely alone. Sometimes all it takes is a storm, a dark road, and one person outside who knows you're inside.